Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a story that the servants of the word-bearers tell each other in hushed, trembling tones, not in ceremony, not in prayer, in fear. It goes like this: somewhere deep inside the Eye of Terror, on a demon world, where the sky is the color of a bruise that never heals, and the ground breathes slowly, like something still alive long past, when it should have stopped. Something hunts them. It does not announce itself. It leaves no manifesto carved in stone, no sermon echoing through warped corridors. What it leaves, scattered across the floors of temple fortresses and blood-soaked processionals, are bodies. Heretic Astartes in dark armor, inscribed with 10,000 years of devotion to the ruinous powers. Iron warriors who have given more than a century of service to entities that could unmake mountains, reduced to something the survivors can barely look at. The shadows moved. Those survivors whisper to each other afterward, in the dark places where they think no one is listening, just the shadows. And then our brothers were gone. When the dark apostle Kaltar finally came face to face with the thing that had been killing his men, he did not encounter a demon in any conventional sense. What he found was something that began as smoke and living darkness. Something with two burning points of pure black where eyes should have been. Something that shattered apart into a screaming cloud of razor-edged birds when you looked directly at it, then pulled itself back together into a shape that was almost human, almost armored, almost recognizable as something that had once belonged to the material world. Almost. It was only when the demon Primarch Lorgar himself appeared, a creature 3 times the height of a space marine, clad in golden runes of crackling dark power, radiating the attention of 4 gods worth of warp energy, that the shadows stopped shifting. It grew, it changed, it built itself upward to match Lorgar's stature, and it wore the face of a man who had died to the Imperium a very long time ago. His name was Corvus Corax. And when he spoke, even Lorgar took a step backward. Welcome back to Q on 40K. Get comfortable. Make a drink, if that is your tradition. This one is going to take its time. Awesome, because the story of how one of the most morally principled Primarchs in the entire history of the Imperium, a man who spent his entire life fighting to free people from chains, became something that Chaos Space Marines treat as a ghost story. A horror they whisper about in the dark places that are supposed to be theirs, is long, and it is layered, and it asks some of the most interesting questions the lore has ever quietly posed to anyone paying close enough attention. Why did Corvus Corax become a monster? The short answer is that centuries of exposure to the raw, formless, howling reality of the warp stripped away the biological shell the Emperor had constructed around him and revealed what was always underneath. But the short answer, as you will find with most things in Warhammer 40,000, is not the interesting answer. The interesting answer does not begin in the Eye of Terror. It does not begin on the black volcanic plains of Istvan Foch. It begins much further back than any of those places. It begins in the dark, beneath a glacier, on a moon that smelled of iron dust and human misery, where a pale child with eyes like 2 holes into nothing was discovered by a girl who took the extraordinary risk of hiding him from people who would have killed them both for doing so. To understand what Corax became, you need to understand what Corax was. And to understand what Corax was, you need to understand the world that made him. Because unlike so many of the Emperor's sons, the world that found Corvus Corax did not give him glory, or power, or the comforting certainty of destiny. It gave him something far more durable and far more dangerous, as it gave him an intimate, bone-deep understanding of what it feels like to be owned by someone who does not see you as a person. And that understanding shaped every decision he ever made, all the way from the first organized act of rebellion in the mine tunnels to the final words spoken in an empty corridor before he walked into the worst place in the galaxy and did not come back for a very long time. That continuity, that unbroken thread running from the boy in chains to the shadow hunting through the Eye of Terror, is the real story here. So let us follow it from the very beginning and take our time with it. It deserves that attention. Part 1. Born in Chains. Lycaeus, the prison moon. And the first revolution, when the Chaos Gods scattered the Emperor's genesons across the galaxy during the earliest days of the Primarch project. They were not trying to destroy them. The gods of the warp are patient in ways that mortal minds struggle to fully conceive. They understood that destroying the Primarchs directly was probably beyond their immediate capability. The Emperor was paying close attention to the project that was his life's most ambitious work. What the Chaos Gods were doing was something more subtle, and in its own way, more elegant. They were trying to corrupt the project through environmental contamination, to ensure that when these demigods were eventually reunited with their father, they would be shaped by worlds he had not chosen, raised by influences he could not control, and defined by experiences that might make them something other than the perfectly calibrated instruments of his will. In that sense, as cruel as the act was, it contained a kind of terrible honesty. The Chaos Gods understood something about the Primarchs that the Emperor perhaps preferred not to dwell on. Environment matters. The clay that something is fired in determines the shape it holds. Even if the original material is extraordinary, you can start with the most perfect genetic material in the galaxy's history and still produce something broken if you fire it in the wrong kiln. And so the gods scattered the infant Primarchs across the stars, letting the galaxy itself be their shaping force, and hoping that enough of them would land in circumstances sufficiently damaging that their eventual reunion with the Emperor would produce instability, conflict, and the conditions for catastrophe. For Corvus Corax, the world that found him was Lycaeus, and Lycaeus was, in its own particular way, precisely designed to produce exactly the kind of person Corax became. Lycaeus was not a place where people lived. It was a place where people were sent. The moon orbited the heavily industrialized forge world of Kievar, and the tech guilds who controlled Kievar had long since worked out that having an unlimited supply of essentially free labor on the moon above them was an extraordinarily convenient arrangement. They had organized their entire society to maintain it. Criminals went to Lycaeus. Political dissidents went to Lycaeus. Workers who failed to meet their production quotas went to Lycaeus. People who asked too many questions, who expressed ideas about justice or human dignity that the guilds found inconvenient, who simply ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time, they went to Lycaeus. The moon was vast enough, the mineral seams deep enough, that this arrangement could continue indefinitely. There were always more mouths, there were always more backs, and the rock always needed digging. The people who lived and worked and slowly died in the tunnels and dust-choked caverns of Lycaeus had nothing. They had the clothes they came in. They had the tools handed to them at the start of each shift. They had the bare minimum of food and water required to keep them functional, because a dead worker produced no minerals and therefore had no economic value. And the guards with shock mauls and projectile weapons ensured that no one made the mistake of wanting anything beyond bare functionality. Children born to slaves were slaves. Old workers who could no longer dig were simply removed from the feeding lists, which was a polite way of saying they were left to die. And everyone understood this, and no one was permitted to say anything about it. There was no appeal process, there was no court. There was no officially sanctioned tomorrow that you were allowed to plan for. There was only the tunnel, and the rock, and the recycled air that tasted of metal and exhaustion, and the guards standing behind you to make sure you kept moving forward. It was into this world, into a lightless chamber beneath a massive glacier on this broken and hopeless moon, was that one of the Emperor's gene pods came to rest. The delivery mechanism was outside the bounds of any physics that the miners of Lycaeus were equipped to understand. The Chaos Gods had thrown it across the galaxy through the warp, and what remained was a sealed container that had survived a journey no instrument could trace, carrying inside it something that had no rational explanation for being there. A child, pale as fresh snow, with skin so white it seemed almost luminescent in the dim glow of the miners' handheld lamps. Eyes that were a deep, solid black, no iris, no white, just two pieces of obsidian that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, that made people feel when they looked at them. vaguely as though they were looking at the sky at night and becoming suddenly aware of just how far it went. He was breathing. Just the girl who first laid eyes on him was named Nasturi Ephrenia. She was part of a team pursuing a mineral seam into a newly opened cavern, and nothing in her life, or her training, or her experience of a world built specifically to deny people the capacity to be surprised by anything good, had prepared her for finding what she found. She looked at this child, impossible and silent in a chamber that should have been empty, and she made a decision that was, by any rational calculation of self-preservation, an extraordinarily stupid one. She hid him. She brought him back to the people she trusted most among her fellow workers, and together, he is this group of people who had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose, who would be executed if discovered harboring something so obviously unprecedented and threatening to the established order, decided to keep him, to feed him from their own already insufficient rations, to raise him in the only way they knew how, surrounded by the only knowledge they had, in a world that had been built specifically to prevent people like them from mattering or surviving or producing anything but minerals and exhaustion. They named him Corax, in the dialect of Low Gothic that the people of Lycaeus had developed over generations in the mines. The word meant the deliverer. There is something in that naming that tells you everything about who these people were and what kind of hope they were capable of, and even in conditions specifically designed to eliminate hope as a functional category. They had no rational reason to believe in deliverers. Their world had given them no evidence that such things existed. Every story they knew about authority and power ended the same way, with the powerful winning and the powerless paying the cost. And yet, looking at this strange, impossible child with his unsettling eyes and his too fast growth rate, and the way he seemed to be cataloguing everything around him with an attention that went far beyond what an ordinary child was capable of, they reached for the word that carried the most hope they had ever been willing to feel out loud. They named him after what they needed him to be. And then, because they were survivors who had learned to be rigorously pragmatic about hope, well, they got to work making him worthy of the name they had given him. What followed over the next years was an education unlike anything most Primarchs received. Corax did not grow up in a palace like Robut Gilliman on Macragge, surrounded by scholars and administrators who taught him the art of governance from a position of institutional security. He did not grow up in the wild like Leman Russ on Fenris, defined by the savage competition of a world that respected only strength and survival. He grew up in a classroom that happened to look like a mine, taught by the very people that the ruling class of Kyavar considered the lowest of the low, the most expendable, the most thoroughly irrelevant. And those teachers, it turned out, knew things that you genuinely cannot learn from a position of privilege. His teachers were political prisoners, people who had been exiled for believing in things like justice and human dignity, who had spent years in the cramped tunnels of Lycaeus thinking carefully about why the world worked the way it did, and whether it was structurally possible to make it work differently. His tutors were convicted criminals who understood from the inside exactly how systems of power protected themselves, where the gaps in any system of control were located, and what would actually happen to you if you tried to exploit those gaps without sufficient preparation and patience. His mentors were exhausted workers who had failed to meet some arbitrary quota and paid for that failure with their freedom. The people who had been given years with nothing to do but think about what a differently organized society might look like, and who had developed, from pure necessity, a sophistication about power dynamics that no privileged education could have produced. These people taught Corax everything they knew, and they taught it with the urgency of people who understood on some level that one day it might actually need to be used. Urban warfare. Because they were absolutely certain that whatever change eventually came would not happen on an open battlefield with banners flying and formal declarations. It would happen in corridors and tunnels and workshops, in spaces where the terrain was intimate and the enemy was embedded in the very infrastructure of the place. Demolitions. Because sometimes the only way to break a system is to specifically identify and remove the structural elements that make it function, and knowing which elements those are requires dedicated study of the system's actual architecture. Psychological operations, because fear and hope are the two most powerful forces available to anyone trying to change the behavior of a large population, and wielding them effectively requires a deep and unsentimental understanding of how both work. Political philosophy, because a revolution without a coherent idea at its center is just a riot, and riots exhaust themselves and leave the powerful more entrenched than before. And patience. Above all else, patience. The guards were always watching. Any coordinated sign of defiance before the moment was precisely right would be crushed, and the people involved would be made into examples that the rest were supposed to learn from. You built in the shadows, you waited for the exact right crack to appear in the system, and then you drove a wedge into it before they could close it again. This is fundamentally not how most of the other Primarchs were raised. Most of them were raised in ways that reinforced, in various ways, the idea that they were special, set apart from ordinary people, above the suffering they witnessed, sufficiently insulated from it that they experienced it as something happening to someone else rather than something happening to them. Corax was raised in a way that made the opposite true. He was inside the suffering. He knew what the guard's boot felt like because he had watched people he loved get hit with it. But he knew what hunger looked like from a distance of approximately 0 because the people feeding him from their own insufficient rations knew what hunger looked like from the inside and out. He was, in a very fundamental and irreversible sense, of the people he was eventually going to fight for, in a way that almost no other Primarch ever managed to be, not by choice, not as a deliberate philosophical commitment adopted later in life, but because it was the simple truth of his first years, and those first years shaped everything that came after them. He was also growing at a rate that no one around him could entirely explain, even with the general awareness that he was not ordinary. Within years, rather than decades, the pale child who had been discovered beneath the glacier had become something that even the Warden Guards could not entirely ignore. They could not explain what they were seeing when their patrols returned with confused reports about sightings. They observed a figure with alabaster skin and solidly black eyes, who seemed to appear in locations before anyone had seen him walk there, who could recite the patrol schedules of every guard post on the moon from memory with the kind of casual precision that should have been operationally impossible, and who made people feel in ways they could not articulate to their supervisors that he was watching them far more carefully than they were watching him. And Corax had discovered through quiet and methodical experimentation during his formative years is that he could do something that even his most experienced mentors could not adequately categorize. He could slip into the shadows and become, for all practical purposes, invisible. Not literally invisible, not in any physical sense. He was still there, still completely tangible, still fully present in the material world. But something in his mind could reach out into the perceptions of the people around him and perform a kind of subtle edit on their awareness. He could remove himself from their conscious notice. They would look directly at him, and their eyes would slide past, finding nothing worth registering, moving on to other parts of the room, as though the space he occupied was simply empty. Machines would still detect him perfectly, anything that processed information through sensors rather than through the messy, exploitable mechanism of organic cognition would notice him without difficulty. But any creature that experienced the world through a brain could walk right past him with a mildly confused expression, wondering vaguely why they had thought they needed to look in that particular direction. He called it the shadow slip. Others called it wraith walking or the shadow walk, or various other names that tried to describe in practical terms something that resisted clean description. In retrospect, noting it for what it was, this was the first genuine hint that Corvus Corax was never entirely a creature of the material world, that whatever the Emperor had used to build him at the most foundational level had included something borrowed from the warp itself, something that already had a deep affinity for the space between perception and reality, for the gap between what physically exists and what organic minds consciously register as existing. When the moment finally came, it came exactly as Corax had planned it. Not as a single spontaneous moment of heroism, not as an impulsive act of defiance that caught the guards by surprise, but as the culmination of months of invisible preparation that had been proceeding in parallel while the moon went on as it always had, the guards oblivious. The rock being dug, the minerals being shipped to Kyavar below. He had organized the workers across the entire moon into independent fighting cells, ensuring that no single arrest or interrogation could unravel the complete network. He had stockpiled weapons in hidden caches throughout the mine tunnels, weapons manufactured quietly in small batches, using the same fabrication equipment that normally produced mining tools, with each component produced separately to avoid detection and assembled in the caches. He had run a sustained psychological campaign against the garrison, carefully staged incidents designed to stretch their attention and their morale to breaking point, ensuring they were looking in the wrong directions when everything finally moved at once. He launched the attack in a precisely coordinated wave across the entire moon simultaneously, and the garrison of Lycaeus was wiped out to the last man in a single day. Kyavar struck back, of course. The tech guilds had resources that dwarfed anything the freed miners could muster. They had professional armies, armored vehicles, air support, and the kind of organized institutional violence that had sustained their power for generations without serious challenge. They sent all of it to Lycaeus, confident that the response would be swift, overwhelming, and comprehensively suppressive. Corvus Corax, who had been studying guerrilla warfare for years specifically in anticipation of this moment, met their counterattack with everything the political prisoners and the criminals and the exhausted workers had taught him. He did not fight them where they were strong. He let them come into terrain he had already prepared, and he hurt them there. And when they adjusted and tried to concentrate force to respond, he was already somewhere else doing something they had not planned for. Supply lines dissolved. Armored columns found themselves ambushed by people who seemed to materialize from the rock itself and vanish before any coherent response could be organized. The guerrilla war ground the tech guild forces down, engagement by grinding engagement over weeks and months. And then, at the moment he calculated the enemy was sufficiently weakened to make the final blow viable, Corvus Corax did something that he would spend the rest of his very long life trying to make peace with. He loaded atomic mining charges, stripped from the moon's own extraction equipment, repurposed for a use that their designers had never imagined, onto small transport shuttles, and sent them along the gravity tethers that connected Lycaeus to Kyavar's surface. He targeted the 5 largest industrial cities on the planet below. The factories burned. Thousands of civilians died. People who had nothing to do with the specific tech guild decisions that had created and maintained the slave system. People who simply happened to live and work in the economic centers that the guilds controlled, and that, as long as they remained functional and producing, would keep funding the war effort against the people of Lycaeus indefinitely. He did not make this decision carelessly or without cost. He had, by every account the law provides, exhausted every alternative and found each of them insufficient. The tech guilds would not negotiate. Their capacity to make war was inseparable from their economic infrastructure, and so he gave the order, and he watched the fires rise from below. He prayed for those souls. He carried those deaths with him, not as a weight he processed stoically and filed away, but as a weight that had genuinely cost him something that could not be recovered. From this single action, so early in his life, so foundational to the person he would become, you can draw a straight line all the way to a locked door in the Ravenspire centuries later, to a year of silence behind sealed stone, and then to a single word spoken to an empty corridor before he walked into the worst place in the galaxy and did not come back in any form that the people who loved him would have found easy to recognize. The pattern was already established at the very beginning, the willingness to pay an unconscionable price for a just outcome, followed by the inability to simply move past having paid it. The survivors of Lycaeus renamed their moon deliverance. They were celebrating, and they had reason to celebrate, just because what Corax had achieved was genuinely extraordinary a revolution accomplished by people who had nothing against the overwhelming organized power of an industrial civilization. Corax stood among them, listening to the celebration, and was already trying to calculate what he owed to the people he had killed in order to free the people he had saved. The Emperor arrived that same day, because the Emperor had always had a particular sense for when and where his sons were. He came alone, no fleet, no escort, no ceremony. After a day and a night of private conversation between father and son, he appointed Corvus Corax Primarch of the 19th Legion and departed. The lore does not tell us what they discussed during that day and night, but Corax emerged from it wearing a new name and a new responsibility, and the weight of Kievar was already in his eyes. Part 2. The Shadow That Walks. Philosophy, Powers, and the Great Crusade. The Primarch who took command of the Raven Guard Legion brought with him a philosophy of war that was entirely his own, forged in the tunnels of Lycaeus and refined through the guerrilla campaigns against Kievar's forces, and fundamentally unlike what most of the other Primarchs brought to the Crusade. Corax's approach to warfare can be summarized simply: strike where the enemy is vulnerable, not where they are strong. Move in ways they cannot anticipate and cannot track. Destroy not the bodies of your opponents, but the infrastructure that makes their opposition possible. The command structure, the communications, the supply lines, the morale. These are the load-bearing walls of any military operation, and if you collapse them selectively and with precision, the whole structure fails without requiring you to fight every defender individually. Never spend your people buying a result you could achieve at lower cost through patience and preparation. And always, always, remember what you are actually fighting for, because the means you choose inevitably shapes the end you achieve. This philosophy made the Raven Guard extraordinarily effective in the campaigns they were designed for. They became the Crusade's premier instrument of covert warfare, the legion you called when you needed an enemy's capacity to resist removed before the main force arrived, when you needed key positions softened and command infrastructure paralyzed by the kind of invisible but precise action that left defenders disoriented and depleted before the formal battle even began. They were extraordinarily good at this. Their Primarch had invented it under conditions where getting it wrong meant being killed, which tends to focus the thinking considerably. The style of warfare was not universally admired. Rogel Dawn, whose approach to war was built around the application of maximum force at the point of maximum concentration, found the Raven Guard's methods indirect to the point of appearing evasive to those who had not watched them work. Ferrus Manus preferred the hammer to the scalpel and had limited patience for operations that took weeks where a frontal assault would take days. But various other Primarchs found the Raven Guard's extreme care about minimizing civilian casualties inefficient. It slowed the rate of compliance and complicated the logistics of bringing worlds into the Imperial fold. Corax understood these criticisms and found most of them beside the point. He was not optimizing for speed of conquest. He was optimizing for the quality of the civilization that existed after the conquest was complete. This came from his background in a way that was impossible to separate from who he was. He had been raised among people who had been conquered, who had experienced what it felt like to live on the receiving end of a military force that treated them as an obstacle to be managed rather than people to be respected. He knew from direct observation, starting in early childhood, that populations who feel liberated cooperate with new governance in ways that populations who feel occupied do not. He knew that terror as a governing tool works until the thing you are using it to suppress grows larger than the terror itself. He had thought about these things carefully for years before he ever commanded a single space marine, and what he had concluded was that the way you win matters almost as much as the fact of winning, because it determines what you have when the fighting stops. His relationship with Horus, the War Master, deteriorated from mild friction to genuine enmity over the course of several campaigns. Horus was brilliant, charismatic, and possessed of a tactical and strategic mind that was genuinely extraordinary, while he was also willing to spend lives in ways that Corax found difficult to accept, most clearly demonstrated during the campaign for the fortified position known as Gate 42, where Horus ordered a frontal assault through a prepared killing ground that decimated the Raven Guard's assault companies, when in Corax's assessment, a longer infiltration operation could have achieved the same result at a fraction of the cost in lives. Corax argued his position clearly and was overruled, and he led the attack himself because that was what a Primarch did when overruled by a Warmaster. But something in him closed after that campaign. The trust that Corax extended to authority figures was not easily given and not easily recovered once damaged. The more psychologically intricate friction was with Conrad Kurz. But to understand that friction, we need to first understand what kind of person Corvus Corax had become by the time of the Great Crusade. Because who he was made what Kurz represented so profoundly disturbing to him. Corvus Corax was, by all credible accounts, one of the most morally consistent Primarchs. He was not naive. He had made choices on Kievar that he knew were wrong by any gentle accounting of right and wrong, and he had made them with his eyes open, which is a different thing from making them in ignorance. He had used fear as a weapon. He had ordered terrible things. He understood that the crusade was built on violence and that he participated in that violence constantly. But underneath all of that, running through all of it like a seam of quartz through dark rock, was a principle he held with the kind of quiet conviction that does not require ceremony or announcement. People who were suffering under oppressive systems deserved better, and if he had the power to deliver better, he was obligated to try. The use of power to protect people who could not protect themselves was not optional. It was the definition of what power was for. He was also, in a way that very few of the other Primarchs were, deeply aware of his own capacity for darkness. He had grown up surrounded by people who had demonstrated to him through their existence that the tools of liberation could very easily become the tools of oppression in the wrong hands. He had used violence. He had ordered deaths. He had made the kind of strategic calculations that put innocent people on the wrong side of a line he had drawn. And he knew these things about himself with a clarity that was unusual in beings as powerful and as often celebrated as Primarchs tended to be. That self-knowledge made him deeply uncomfortable around one specific brother, because that brother was a mirror that showed him a version of himself he could not bear to look at for too long. His appearance was consistent with his character in ways that the lore clearly intends as meaningful. The alabaster skin that reflected almost no colour, not pale in the way that ordinary humans are pale, but white in a way that suggested an absence rather than a presence, as though the normal warmth of living tissue had been replaced with something cooler and more permanent. The hair as black as a raven's wing, and the eyes, most striking of all, which were a solid, deep black with no white, no iris, no variation. Eyes that people described as looking like two windows into empty space, as though you were not looking at someone's eyes, but at two holes in the surface of the world through which you could glimpse something that was not quite the same world. He was physically beautiful in a way that was also slightly frightening, in the way that a very still, very intelligent animal is beautiful. The beauty of something that is absolutely attentive in all directions simultaneously. He carried weapons that told the same story about who he was. A pair of meter-long lightning claws that he wielded with the precision of a surgeon rather than the bludgeoning force of an executioner. A coiled power whip at his belt that he had kept since Lycaeus as a reminder of the cruelty he had overthrown. And on his back a jetpack formed into articulated raven-like pinions that he could deploy as weapons in their own right. Nothing about his armament was ceremonial. Everything about it was functional. He was, in the language of how Primarchs expressed their identities through their tools, precisely what he appeared to be. A being defined by swift, invisible, decisive violence in service of very specific and carefully chosen ends. During the Great Crusade, the Raven Guard served frequently under Horus's direct command, and it was during this period that the comparison between Corax and Conrad Kurz became a persistent, uncomfortable theme. The Night Lords and the Raven Guard operated in the same theatre, on enough occasions that the similarities between the two Primarchs became impossible for anyone paying attention to ignore. And both had been raised on worlds of oppression and suffering. Both had developed an almost supernatural facility for darkness and invisibility. Both used fear as a tool. Both had built their entire approach to war around striking from unexpected directions at unexpected moments. They even looked similar in ways that went beyond coincidence, both pale, both dark-eyed, both carrying about them the quality of something that was most at home in the shadow. The difference was everything. Kersey directed his darkness outward at populations, at civilians, at conquered peoples, at anyone within range who could be made to feel fear, because to Kurz, fear was an end in itself, the natural and appropriate state of a universe that operated by power rather than by justice. And Corax directed his darkness very specifically at the people responsible for maintaining systems of oppression while going to extraordinary lengths to protect everyone else. To Kersey, the distinction between the oppressor and the oppressed was not particularly meaningful. To Corax, it was the most important distinction in existence, but Kersey used this against him. In their encounters, Kersey would point at Corax and say, in various ways across multiple confrontations, "You and I are the same thing. We came from the same darkness. We use the same tools. The only thing that separates us is what we tell ourselves about why." The children of Kievar who died in your atomic bombardment had no interest in your fine moral distinctions. The people your shadow walk leaves screaming behind you are not comforted by your principles. Corax rejected these arguments, clearly, with conviction, every time. But the rejection required sustained effort in a way that most refusals do not, because the arguments were not entirely without merit in their specific observations, even when their overall conclusion was catastrophically wrong. Corax knew this. He was honest with himself in the way that people who have grown up needing to be honest about uncomfortable things to survive tend to be honest. And so the fear of becoming Kurz lived in him not as an abstract philosophical anxiety, but as a concrete ongoing vigilance, a constant checking and rechecking of his own methods against his own principles, a refusal to let the vigilance lapse, an insistence on making the distinction between his darkness and Kurz's darkness in every specific decision, every day. Because if you stop making it actively, you might stop noticing when it had blurred. And then, Istvan Fey happened. Part 3. The Mirror He Feared, Corax and the Night Haunter in depth. It is worth spending more time on the relationship between Corvus Corax and Conrad Kurz than most summaries of the heresy allow, because that relationship is one of the more psychologically interesting threads in the entire lore, and because understanding it fully is essential to understanding why what happened at Istvan Fey affected Corax the way it did. Kersey had grown up on Nostromo, a world of perpetual darkness and total social collapse, a lightless industrial planet where organized crime was not the exception, but the organizing principle. I see where the people with power were the people willing to do the worst things to the people who had less of it, and where the only concept of order available was the order imposed by terror. He had survived by becoming the most dangerous thing on the planet, hunting criminals through sewers and back alleys, learning from direct experience that in a world without any operative structure of justice, fear was the only currency that any significant portion of the population would consistently respond to. He became the Night Haunter, the darkness that punished, and his methods produced measurable results. Nostromo became orderly in the way that a room becomes quiet when something large and dangerous walks into it. When the Emperor found him and put him in command of the Night Lord's Legion, Kersey brought that philosophy with him, and the Night Lords became, in the context of the Crusade, a remarkably effective instrument of terror-based compliance. Worlds submitted not because they had been outfought, but because they had been made to understand in terms sufficiently vivid to be indelible, that continued resistance would produce consequences that no one in the population would want to experience or witness. Kersey understood terror the way a physician understands disease, from the inside, through intimate acquaintance, with a diagnostic precision that came from having it act upon him and upon the people around him for his entire formative life. The Night Lord's methods disgusted Corax on a level that was visceral rather than merely strategic. But he did not simply think that mass slaughter of civilian populations was counterproductive. He found it morally obscene in the direct, gut-level way that someone who has been enslaved finds the sight of a slave collar obscene, without needing to reason through why, simply as a reaction from somewhere deep and settled.
Okay, I want to stop here for a second because, honestly, this is the part of Corax's story that gets me every time. Most Primarchs, when they lose something, they channel it into rage or denial or just brute forward momentum. Corax does something different. He sits with it, he carries it, he accounts for it like someone who actually feels the weight of what happened and refuses to pretend otherwise. And I think that's part of why his story hits differently from, say, Angron or even Magnus, about power corrupting. He's a cautionary tale about being genuinely good in a universe that doesn't particularly reward that. What gets me is that he knew what Istvan cost. He walked out of there with the numbers in his head. Over 75,000 suns one afternoon, and he didn't get to grieve. He just had to keep going. And I think everything that comes after, the Raptor program, the guild, the locked room, the walk into the eye, all of it makes complete sense when you understand that this is a person who never got to put the weight down. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
The encounters between the two Primarchs that the lore records are consistently characterized by a revulsion on Corax's part that went beyond tactical disagreement and into something that he had difficulty moderating, because it was connected to things that had happened to him and to people he had loved when he was very young and that had shaped him in ways that reasoning could not fully govern. But Kersey had thought carefully about what Corax's revulsion said about Corax. And he had concluded, and he articulated this conclusion with the peculiar bitterness of someone who feels that a fundamental injustice has been done to them by comparison, that Corax's celebrated moral consistency was a form of self-deception, that Corax was a different flavor of the same thing he was. Two creatures of darkness, raised in suffering, using the tools of fear and invisible violence to impose their will on a galaxy that had not asked for their attention. The only difference, Kersey argued, was that Corax had a more flattering story to tell himself about his targets, and that story had been accepted by the people in power because it was more useful to them. There is a quote preserved in the Konrad Curze Primarchs novel, credited to Curze himself, that makes this explicit in a way that is difficult to dismiss, even while disagreeing with its conclusion. Kersey says, reflecting on Corax, "I wonder often if Corax would have followed me into this same darkness had the war not come. He and I were so similar. We could have been twins. The same darkness, the same tools, the same preoccupation with justice, in our different ways. Both of us raised among criminals. Both of us creatures of the shadow. And in another life, with different teachers, a different first world, a different set of early lessons about where suffering came from and what you were permitted to do about it, we might have been indistinguishable." Corax knew Curze was right about the similarities. He had known it for a long time before Kersey said it out loud. And that knowledge was the source of the sustained vigilance, the constant checking, the refusal to let any individual decisions slide past without scrutiny, the deep discomfort with comparisons that were not entirely wrong, even though their conclusions were. He was afraid of Konrad Curze, not in the way you are afraid of an enemy, but in the way you are afraid of a version of yourself that you can almost see in the mirror under the right lighting. The version that made different choices early on and arrived somewhere you would not have chosen to go. At Istvan Futh, Kersey would demonstrate one more thing to Corax, that when it mattered most, the distance Corax had worked so hard to maintain between them could be collapsed in an instant by someone willing to be the thing Corax feared. Hughes did not just fight on the wrong side at the drop site massacre. He personally intervened in the moment when Corax was about to kill Lorgar. He saved the architect of the heresy at the precise moment when Corax could have ended it, or at least significantly shortened it, and in doing so, he forced Corax to run, to leave the field, to survive when fighting would have meant dying. And survival, in that moment, felt like a form of failure that all the strategic arguments in the galaxy could not make entirely clean. Part 4. The Black Sands of Istvan Futh, the day everything changed. The drop site massacre of Istvan Futh is one of those events in the Warhammer 40,000 lore that exists in a category all by itself. It is not simply a military defeat, not just a moment of betrayal, though it is certainly both of those things in their most extreme and devastating forms. It is the moment at which the narrative of the Horus heresy shifted permanently from something that could theoretically be resolved quickly into a galaxy-spanning civil war that would eventually consume hundreds of millions of lives and leave scars on the Imperium so deep that 10,000 years later, the institution is still defined by them in fundamental ways. For Corvus Corax specifically, Istvan V is the wound that never fully closed. Everything that came after, all the guilt, all the desperation, all the increasingly terrible decisions made from the best possible intentions, and eventually the locked room and the final word and the walk into the dark, flows from what happened on those black volcanic plains over the course of a single catastrophic afternoon. To understand the trajectory of his transformation, you have to understand this day not just as a military event, but as a psychological one, as the moment when the accumulated weight of all Corax's carefully maintained principles came into direct collision with a reality that they had not prepared him for. The planning that led to the massacre was a failure of imagination on the part of people who were operating in a universe where their brothers were supposed to be reliable. Rogel Dawn, working from the best available intelligence, understood that Horus had rebelled and needed to be dealt with decisively. But he did not yet understand the scale of the betrayal, did not yet know that 3 of the 7 legions he was dispatching to deal with the problem were already operating under orders from Horus himself, that what he was organizing was not a punitive strike force, but an extremely expensive trap designed to eliminate the Emperor's most capable loyal legions at a single stroke. The order went out. 7 legions moved toward Istvan V, 3 loyal, 4 secretly sworn to the War Master, a hammer disguised as a rescue, the loyal First Wave, the Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, the Salamanders under Vulcan, the Raven Guard under Corax, arrived at Istvan V and held a council of war aboard the Ferrum. The defensive network the traitors had constructed in the Urgal Depression was formidable, void shields that prevented orbital bombardment from solving the problem directly, a prepared killing ground designed to funnel attackers through fields of fire, extensive fortifications. Corax and Vulcan both argued for waiting until the second wave of supposedly loyal legions arrived before committing to a surface assault. Ferrus Manus overruled them. He was burning with the cold fury of a man who had received information about Fulgrim's betrayal personally and could not contain the need to respond. He argued that the 3 legions had sufficient combined strength to make meaningful progress before the second wave added its weight to the assault. It was the wrong call. Corax knew it was the wrong call. But Ferrus had seniority of command in this theatre, and the argument that waiting for the second wave was clearly superior was not absolute. There was enough genuine uncertainty about timing and traitor force disposition that a reasonable officer could make the case for immediate action. Corax registered his objection and descended to Istvan V anyway, because that was the structure he was operating within. The Raven Guard hit the right flank of the traitor defensive position in the Urgal Depression with everything they had, doing what they were best at, exploiting gaps, hitting hard and fast, maintaining the momentum that the enemy cannot easily respond to, because by the time they have organized a counter, you are already somewhere else. For hours, whilst the battle had the rhythm of something brutal but comprehensible, the loyal legions bleeding, taking casualties, pushing forward anyway, because the mission required it. The Raven Guard specifically operated with the efficiency that 3 decades of Crusade campaigning had honed, and Corax was in the middle of it, fighting with the precision that made him one of the most genuinely dangerous individuals the Imperium had ever produced in close combat. And then he found Lorgar. The Primarch of the Wordbearers was, in a historical sense that most people outside very specific scholarly traditions do not fully appreciate, the architect of the Horus heresy in a more complete way than even Horus himself. It was Lorgar who had first discovered the reality of the Chaos Gods and embraced them, a Lorgar whose word-bearers had been secretly corrupting other legions for decades before the first shot of the heresy was fired. Lorgar, who had organized the demonic ritual on Davin that corrupted Horus and set the entire catastrophe in motion. Everything that was happening on Istvan Fur, the betrayal, the slaughter, the destruction of 3 legions, was the direct consequence of decisions Lorgar had made. He was the root of it, and here he was, close enough to reach. Corax drove his lightning claws through Lorgar, pinned him, prepared the killing blow that was, by any reasonable historical calculation, the single most consequential action Corvus Corax could have taken in that moment. Because killing Lorgar at Istvan V would have cut off the Wordbearer's divine inspiration, thrown that legion into chaos at a critical moment, and potentially altered the entire arc of the heresy in ways that cascade through every subsequent event. The blow was raised. It was coming down. Konrad Curzi came out of nowhere. He intercepted Corax at the precise moment of the kill, pressing his own lightning claws against Corax's in a physical contest that forced Corax to break contact with Lorgar. As the lore describes it, Curzi gripped Corax's wrist to prevent escape, and Corax burned the fuel reserves of his jetpack to wrench free and launch himself skyward. And looking down at the ridgeline as he gained altitude, he saw what was happening with the second wave. He saw guns that were supposed to be pointing at Horus's forces pointing at the people behind him. He understood, as in the flash of clarity that comes when the pattern you have been suspecting but refusing to fully believe becomes unmistakable, that this had been planned. All of it. The disposition of the second wave. The timing of their positioning. The way the traitors who had been retreating suddenly stopped retreating. Everything. Planned in advance. They were caught between 2 forces, both intent on killing them, with nowhere to go. What followed is recorded as the Dropsite Massacre. The loyal legions were caught between the traitors they had been fighting in front and the traitors who revealed themselves behind. They were exhausted from the first phase of battle, ammunition reduced, casualties already significant, momentum spent. And now, Mortarian's Death Guard and Angron's World Eaters joined the slaughter, and an Imperator-class Titan designated Dies Irae stalked through the carnage, and the killing field became something that exceeded any category normal military language had for describing defeat. The Raven Guard lost between 75,000 and 80,000 warriors in a single day, in one afternoon. One legion, reduced from a force capable of reshaping entire campaigns to a few thousand shell-shocked survivors hiding in the highlands. Corax survived by doing the thing he had never done before. He ran. He gathered what remained, and he ran, fighting his way through the enemy formations between his people and the only possible extraction point, burning everything he had to keep them moving. He did not stop and make a heroic final stand. He did not choose death over the compromised feeling of retreat. He chose survival, because the strategic calculation was clear, and the emotional cost was something he would pay later. He pulled his people back. He hid in the highlands of Istvan V. He kept them alive. He kept them alive for 98 days. 98 days on a planet that had become a graveyard, with enemies who knew the terrain and were actively hunting the survivors, with almost nothing in the way of resupply or support. Corax kept the Raven Guard alive using every lesson those political prisoners and criminals and exhausted workers had taught him in the tunnels of Lycaeus. Move quietly, strike only when the advantage is overwhelming. Do not be where the enemy expects. Keep the people around you together by making them believe that tomorrow is worth surviving to. He did this for 98 consecutive days, fought on a planet that had been specifically converted into a killing ground by forces far larger than his, using nothing but skill and stubbornness and the refusal to accept that there was no way out. When Captain Brannon Nev's small rescue fleet arrived, drawn there by the haunted premonitory dreams of an Imperial army officer named Marcus Valerius, Corax loaded his survivors and left. 5,000 warriors, in return for more than 75,000 dead. The numbers are important, not as abstract statistics, but as a specific daily reality that Corax was going to be living with for the rest of his existence. Every decision he made from that point forward was made against the background of those numbers. The desperate urgency that drove him to accept risks he would never otherwise have accepted were to reach for solutions that he would otherwise have examined more carefully, to do things that the person he had been before Istvan Futh would have looked at with the same cool, measured skepticism he applied to everything else. All of it came from those numbers, from the specific, irreplaceable human cost of a single day's betrayal and his inability to prevent it. He would have killed Lorgar. If Kersey had not been there, he would have changed the war, and instead the architect of the heresy was alive. The war would continue for years, and more than 75,000 of his sons were dead on a planet he was leaving behind. The weight of that arithmetic was going to press on every subsequent choice he made, in ways that even Corax's formidable self-awareness was not entirely going to be able to counterbalance. In Part 5, The Forbidden Gift, the Emperor's Secret, and the Raptor program, Corvus Corax arrived at Terra in the immediate aftermath of Istvan Futh, because the one thing he could not afford to do was stop moving. The heresy was progressing on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Imperium's defensive situation was deteriorating by the month, and the Raven Guard, which had been one of the most capable legions in the Emperor's service, renowned for the precision and effectiveness of their covert operations, now consisted of a few thousand survivors who were exhausted, traumatized, under-equipped, and psychologically marked by what they had survived. If they were to contribute anything meaningful to the war effort that now defined whether humanity had a future, they needed to rebuild. And they needed to do it at a speed that the normal process of Space Marine development could not possibly achieve. The Emperor was not available in any conventional sense. He had sealed himself in the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace to manage a crisis in the Webway, a catastrophic incursion through a dimensional corridor the Emperor had been building as a protected path through the Imperium, a project that had been compromised by Magnus the Red's well-intentioned but devastating psychic intrusion. The Emperor was fighting a war in another dimension simultaneously with the visible war above ground, and the gatekeepers of access to him, Rogel Dawn, who had been given command of Terra's defences, and Malkador the Sigillite, who served as regent, were deeply reluctant to divert any portion of his attention for anything short of absolute necessity. Corax pushed past their reluctance, because the loss of more than 75,000 sons tends to recalibrate a person's definition of what constitutes absolute necessity. He pushed hard enough, and with enough raw psychic desperation, that the Emperor somehow heard him through whatever portion of his enormous psychic awareness could be diverted from the dimensional battle below. What the Emperor transmitted back was not comfort, not strategy, not the kind of reassurance a father might offer a son who has just watched his family nearly destroyed. What he transmitted was a memory, a precise, detailed psychic impression of a location, as coordinates of something buried deep beneath the Imperial Palace in a hidden laboratory sealed behind a maze of protective mechanisms the Emperor had built during the Primarch project itself, the Labyrinth. Inside it, the undifferentiated genetic template, the raw material from which the Primarchs themselves had been constructed. Corax navigated the Labyrinth, which was genuinely dangerous in ways that required full engagement with everything he was capable of. Its traps were calibrated against beings of his level of ability, because the Emperor had designed it to protect something that a being of his level of ability might want to steal. He retrieved what was stored there, brought it back to Deliverance. And then he and his most capable scientific personnel, Chief Apothecary Vincente VI and a Mechanicum Genitor named Nexin or Landriaz, spent weeks analysing it, running projections, and developing what was, in retrospect, the most audacious proposal in the history of the Space Marine programs. The theory was elegant in the focused, high-pressure way of ideas developed under extreme urgency. If you could take the accelerated growth factors embedded in pure, undiluted Primarch genetics, the factors that had allowed the Primarchs themselves to mature from infants to demigods in years rather than decades, and introduce them carefully into the Raven Guard's gene seed implantation process, you could potentially compress what normally took years into weeks. As the normal process of creating a Space Marine required a decade or more of careful development, each of the approximately 19 implants requiring time to stabilize and integrate before the next could safely be added. The accelerated process, if it worked, would bypass all of that. Instead of requiring years per recruit, you could theoretically process hundreds per month. The math was compelling. The moral calculus for Corax in that specific moment was at least arguable. The heresy was progressing. Every month that passed with the Raven Guard under strength was a month that the deaths on Istvan Farth meant a little less. The risk, and Corax was not unaware of it, because he was never unaware of risks, was that he was attempting something the Emperor had never sanctioned for any purpose other than the original Primarch creation, and compressing a biological process of enormous complexity under wartime conditions with imperfect resources and incomplete understanding. The risk was that it might not work cleanly. He made the call. The first batch of new warriors emerged from the accelerated process and exceeded every projection. They were faster than standard Raven Guard, physically more capable, cognitively sharper. They were extraordinary. Corax designated them Raptors, a name that reflected both the bird imagery of his legion and the predatory precision their enhanced capabilities promised. He assigned them armor, placed them under Captain Branay Nev's command, and began planning for the next batch. He did not know that the Alpha Legion was already inside his house. He did not know that the surviving warriors who had escaped Istvanfar 5 with him included, embedded among them, Alpha Legion operatives who had performed surgical operations on the corpses of dead Raven Guard warriors, implanting those faces over their own to achieve a cosmetic disguise precise enough to pass field-level biological screening. He did not know that these infiltrators had been gathering intelligence since before the ships left the Istvan system, reporting back to Omegon, one of the two twin Primarchs who led the Alpha Legion, who had established himself in hiding on Kyavar below, coordinating with the remnants of the old Tech Guild establishment that Corax had dismantled years ago but never entirely eliminated. One of those infiltrators, operating under the internal code designation Alpharius, was positioned within the gene labs at precisely the right moment. So when the second batch of Raptors was being prepared, working under the careful protocols that Six and Orlandriaz had developed, this operative introduced something into the genetic material that was not supposed to be there. A contaminant extracted from demonic ichor, processed by a renegade Dark Mechanicum tech priest who was also embedded in Omegon's network, specifically designed to remain below the detection threshold of the monitoring protocols, but to have catastrophic effects on the developmental process of the subsequent batch of recruits. The second batch of Raptors emerged wrong, not subtly wrong, not in ways that could be explained as normal genocide instability or developmental variation. Catastrophically, grotesquely, irreversibly wrong. Scales erupted across skin in patterns that had no organic logic, as muscle tissue grew past any functional boundary, shifting and bulging in configurations that served no structural purpose. Horns pushed through skulls, limbs elongated into shapes that the human body had no mechanical use for. Faces changed in ways that moved away from human towards something that the surviving observers described with a consistent vocabulary of horror. These were not warriors who had undergone minor developmental issues. These were people who had volunteered to serve, who had survived the initial round of successful production and understood what they were supposed to become, now wearing something that bore no resemblance to what a space marine was supposed to be. And some of them, perhaps most horrifyingly, retained their minds. Some of them were still, or underneath the physical catastrophe that had been wrought on their bodies, recognizably the people who had entered the process. They knew what they had been. They knew what they had been promised they would become. They could see the gap between those two things and had no way to close it. They were people in bodies that had become prisons of a very specific and very cruel kind. And they understood this. Corax did not collapse under this. He was not permitted to collapse because the war was still happening and the Legion still needed him functional. He kept deploying the successful Raptors in operations. He kept fighting. He isolated the source of the contamination when it became possible to do so, though by then the damage was done. He destroyed what remained of the gene lab to prevent further contamination from spreading, when he carried the promise he had made to the mutated raptors, that he would ask the Emperor to help reverse what had been done to them when the war was won, through every subsequent engagement of the heresy, watching some of them slowly deteriorate further as the months and years of the war progressed, watching the people they had been recede a little further with each passing season. He had made them, and he had failed to protect the process that made them from the people who wanted to destroy the Raven Guard from the inside. And now he was carrying them, and their suffering, and his promise, and the knowledge that the Emperor was no longer in any position to fulfill that promise, even if Corax could find a way to ask, carrying all of it through a war that showed no signs of resolving quickly, fighting for an Imperium that was hemorrhaging faster than anyone could stanch the bleeding, on behalf of an Emperor who was somewhere below the Imperial Palace, fighting a battle that none of his sons could help him fight. At the Battle of Yarant, where the Raven Guard intervened to save the Space Wolves and the barely surviving Leman Russ, Corax stood at the edge of a decision he almost could not pull himself back from. The situation was desperate enough that a final heroic stand seemed not just possible but appropriate, a way to spend everything that remained, including the mutated raptors, in a blaze of purposeful ending that would at least mean their deaths served the Imperium's survival. He had planned for it. He had positioned his forces for it. And then he recognized the impulse for exactly what it was, a desire to be done with the weight, to trade it for a clean death rather than continue carrying it indefinitely. He ordered the evacuation. He kept his people alive. He kept his promise to keep going. And he carried the weight all the way back to Deliverance, where it would wait for him in the holding cells of the Raven Spire. Part 6. The Weight of Guilt. Killing his children and the silence of Ravenspire. The Horus heresy ended. Horus was killed on the bridge of his flagship by an emperor who paid a price for that killing that the Imperium is still paying 10,000 years later. The traitor legions fled through the Eye of Terror, beginning the long exile that defines them in the contemporary setting. The Siege of Terror was over. The vast, the galaxy-consuming catastrophe that had consumed years and uncountable lives resolved itself into a quiet that was not peace. It was far too complicated for peace, but that at least represented the end of the acute phase of the catastrophe. The Imperium that came out of the Horus heresy was a wounded, changed thing. Reboot Gilliman, whose particular genius was the administration of vast and complex systems, understood that the structural conditions which had made the heresy possible needed to be addressed in the most permanent way available. The fundamental problem was concentration of power. A single Primarch commanding 100,000 Space Marines was a force that could challenge the Imperium itself, as the heresy had just demonstrated at horrifying cost. As the solution, codified in the Codex Astartes, was simple in concept and painful in implementation. Break the legions apart. No more legions. Each one becomes multiple chapters. Each chapter capped at roughly 1,000 warriors. Each chapter independently organized and led, none of them capable of threatening the Imperium the way the traitor legions had. The sons of any Primarch would be spread across multiple organizations, connected by lineage and tradition, but not by command structure. Corax accepted this. He understood the logic and found it sound. He agreed, on reflection, that Gilliman's vision was correct. The conditions that had permitted the heresy to happen could not be permitted to persist unchanged. The restructuring of the Raven Guard into second founding successor chapters proceeded, and what had been a legion became several smaller organizations, each carrying forward a portion of the Raven Lord's legacy. Corax participated in this process. He helped establish the successor organizations. He did what a responsible Primarch did in a transition that he recognized as necessary, even if it was painful. And then he had to deal with what was waiting in the holding cells of the Raven Spire. The mutated raptors who had survived the war were still there. The ones who had retained enough cognitive coherence to keep fighting were still alive, housed in the lower levels of the fortress. Technically still part of the Legion's order of battle, but increasingly difficult to deploy in any conventional sense for reasons that did not need to be spelled out. Some of them had continued to deteriorate during the years of the war, and some of them were barely recognizable as what they had been. Some of them, still lucid enough to understand their own situation with the specific cruelty that clarity about one's own deterioration produces, had spent the last period of the war in a state of suspended hope, waiting for the victory that would allow Corax to make good on his promise, that would make it possible for the Emperor to address what had been done to them, to reverse the contamination and restore them to what they should have been. The Emperor was not available. The Emperor would never be available again in any form that was relevant to that promise. The Golden Throne held a body that was technically alive and was producing the Astronomicon that made faster-than-light travel possible, and was holding back a tide of psychic catastrophe from below. But it was not doing any of these things while also reversing the effects of Alpha Legion contamination on a few hundred Raven Guard recruits. The promise Corax had carried for years had nowhere to go. Corax made the only decision that was honest about this reality, and it was the worst decision he would ever be required to make, in the specific way that the worst decisions are the ones where every option available to you is terrible, and you are choosing between different kinds of terrible rather than between terrible and good. He killed them, each one, by his own hand. He had made them. He had allowed the program that produced them to proceed. He had failed to protect the gene labs from the Alpha Legion's sabotage. He had carried them through a war he had promised would end with their restoration, and it had ended without that restoration. He was responsible for what they were, in a chain of accountability that he traced with the exhausting, merciless thoroughness that had always characterized his relationship with his own decisions. And so he was the one who ended it, one, by his own hand. The law is deliberately quiet about the details of how this was accomplished or how long it took. And perhaps that silence is the most honest thing the law can do with something this private and this terrible. What it tells us is that Corax prayed over each of them, that he asked for the Emperor's forgiveness with each mercy killing, not on behalf of the Raptors, who had not asked for what had been done to them and deserved only compassion, but on his own behalf, for what he had done to them and for what he was now doing to them, and for the fact that he would have to keep living with it afterward when they would not. When it was done, he locked himself in his private chambers in the Raven Spire. The door did not open for a year. What happened inside that room during those 12 months belongs entirely to Corvus Corax, and the law does not presume to describe it. He was alive. The life support systems in the chamber functioned. There were subtle signs of occupancy. Occasional sounds filtered through the sealed stone, but no one who knocked received any response. He had chosen, quite deliberately, to be unknowable during that period. As the man who had spent his entire existence in service of other people's liberation, who had organized revolutions and led campaigns and commanded legions, had locked himself in a box and left strict instructions that he was not to be disturbed. Think about what that year represented. From the perspective of the Raven Guard watching the sealed door, their Primarch had been through the destruction of most of his legion, years of shadow warfare, the genetic catastrophe of the Raptor program, personally killing the people that catastrophe had produced, and the end of a war that had taken everyone who had not survived it and changed everyone who had. They watched the door, and they waited, because there was nothing else to do, and because the alternative, that the door might never open again, was not something they could look at directly. When a year to the day, the door opened. Corvus Corax walked out of the Raven Spire. He spoke to no one about what the year had contained. He walked through the fortress without stopping. He boarded a transport that had been prepared, because even in his isolation, he had apparently communicated enough through the logistics systems of the Raven Spire for the minimal necessary preparations to be made. He set a course pointing, without any possible ambiguity, toward the Eye of Terror. And before anyone could find the right words to say, or any way to stop him, or ask him anything useful, he spoke his last recorded words. Nevermore. The reference is from The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, a poem about a man consumed by grief who asks a raven over and over whether he will ever be free of the weight of what he has lost, and receives the same single answer every time. The raven's word, the poem's last word, it means no. Not for you, not for what you have done, not in any form that feels like relief. Not here, not ever. The thing you are asking about is gone and is not coming back. And you can keep asking until you exhaust every possible variation of the question, but the answer will not change. Corvus Corax said this to his sons, to the Imperium he had served at such enormous cost, to the memory of more than 75,000 brothers, to the shadows of everyone who had taught him in the tunnels of Lycaeus and died before they could see what their teaching produced. He said, "Nevermore," and he walked into the Eye of Terror, and the door closed behind him. What happened to him inside the Eye is where the story becomes something genuinely strange, not because the lore describes a corruption, but because it describes something more interesting and more philosophically demanding than corruption. Part 7. Inside the Eye of Terror. What the warp does to a Primarch. The Eye of Terror is not a dangerous place in any ordinary sense of that phrase. Most dangerous places in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy are dangerous in ways that are, broadly speaking, physical. They contain hostile conditions or hostile occupants, and the threat they present is a threat to the physical continuity of a person's body. You can die in the void of space, or on a death world, or in a tyrannid hive fleet. And while those deaths are various and often terrible, they are all ultimately mechanical in their causation. Something damaged your physical matter until your physical matter stopped functioning. The Eye of Terror is categorically, structurally different. It is a region of real space where the boundary between the material universe and the warp, the psychic dimension that underlies physical reality, the place where thought and emotion become tangible substance, has been permanently and catastrophically collapsed. Not weakened, not permeable, collapsed. Inside the Eye, the two realities exist simultaneously in a state of constant mutual interference. Physics operates, but unreliably. Time runs, but not at a consistent rate or in a consistent direction. Cause and effect are present, but have become suggestions rather than laws. Things that usually apply in this area. But that can be overridden by sufficient conviction or sufficient power, or simply by the accumulated weight of a lot of warp entities, all believing very hard in something different. Emotions have physical mass. Thought can reshape landscape. The entities that inhabit this space, the demons, the fragments of vast psychic powers, the creatures that are made from the distilled residue of mortal feeling, are not foreign invaders. They are the local life forms of a place that was, effectively, constructed from suffering. What the Eye does to ordinary humans is quick and terrible in ways the lore has catalogued extensively. The warp finds the undefended parts of a human consciousness and works at them, reshaping what it finds according to the laws of the immaterium rather than the laws of physics. Yet until what remains is something that is recognizably human in origin, but no longer entirely human in operation. What it does to Space Marines is slower and more variable. Their psychological conditioning and the particular architecture of their enhanced biology give them considerably more resistance to passive corruption, though not immunity. What it does to Chaos Space Marines who have chosen to operate inside it is shaped by the compact they have made with specific Chaos powers, who protect their investment by maintaining a version of the person they need for their purposes. What the Eye does to a loyal Primarch who has entered it without compact or protection, as who has brought with him nothing to offer any Chaos God, and nothing to protect him from the full exposure of the Immaterium. This is something the lore had largely not addressed before Corax's story, and the answer it gives is the most philosophically interesting piece of lore in the entire Corax arc. The Primarchs were made with a component that the Emperor was careful never to fully specify even to his most trusted servants. The biological shell, the enhanced genetics, the gene seed, and all its engineered complexity. These were products of the most advanced genetic science in the galaxy's history, and they were documented, studied, and maintained by the Mechanicum with the devotion that institution reserves for things it considers sacred. But there was something else. Is something that the lore describes in various places as the Primarch's warp-formed consciousness, their soul made of immaterium substance, the essential thing that they were at the most foundational level before any of the genetic engineering was applied to it. The Emperor, when he created the Primarchs, reached into the warp itself and took something of it and shaped it into the beginning of what his sons would become. The biological layer was the house. The warp-formed consciousness was the thing that lived in the house. This is, when you think about it, why the Chaos Gods were so specifically interested in corrupting the Primarchs rather than simply destroying them. Not just because they were powerful military leaders, whose loss would weaken the Emperor's war effort, but because they were already, at their most fundamental level, warp-formed entities wearing biological shells. They were already, in the most essential sense, creatures of the Imperium. What the Chaos Gods offered through corruption was not transformation from material to warp. That transformation was already complete, just hidden. But a realignment of priority. Which layer would dominate? Which reality would define the whole? Lorgar had accepted this offer consciously and completely. He had concluded, with genuine philosophical conviction, that the Chaos Gods were the true powers of the universe, that submission to them was the only honest response to what they were. He had submitted to the process of becoming what he now was, a demon Primarch, as a being that was still recognizably Lorgar in his speech and his religious obsessions, but that now operated primarily according to the priorities of the Imperium, sustained by divine attention, reshaped by his patrons into the most effective instrument of their combined will. Corvus Corax made no such bargain. He entered the Eye carrying nothing to offer any Chaos God. No devotion, no faith, no willingness to submit, no aspect of his values that mapped usefully onto what any specific warp power required of its servants. He went in with only what he had always carried, a specific identity, a specific set of values, and a specific objective. He went to hunt the people who had destroyed his legion. And the Eye of Terror, which had no compact to honor and no divine patron to perform the reshaping deliberately, just did what it does to any warp-sensitive entity exposed to it for long enough without protection. It stripped away the outer layers, not in the corrupting way that happens to people who submit to chaos, not through the process of finding the seed of a Chaos God's nature in the person's values and cultivating it until it consumes everything else. More like the way that sustained immersion in deep water eventually saturates any material that is not completely impermeable, finding every small gap, every structural vulnerability, gradually removing everything that could be removed until what remains is the irreducible core that was always there underneath. The Eye found the biological construct the Emperor had wrapped around Corax's foundational warp nature, and over what must have been decades or centuries, time inside the Eye is not reliable, and the exact duration is impossible to determine from any external reference point, wore it away. What remained was Corax, the irreducible, essential Corax, no longer mediated by biological matter, operating now as the warp-formed consciousness he had always been at the deepest level. And because the Eye was not corrupting him, but revealing him, what it revealed was what he actually was: shadow, and the capacity to move through it without leaving traces, the ability to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, the orientation toward vengeance and toward a very specific kind of justice that had defined him since the day he organized his first fighting cell in the mine tunnels of Lycaeus, and ravens in impossible numbers, dark birds that were not separate creatures, but extensions of a single will that moved as one entity across the landscape of demon worlds and tore apart what they found there. He was not a demon. Lorgar himself said as much. In the most significant moment of their confrontation in the short story Shadow of the Past, and Lorgar knew what a demon was from the inside, having spent years becoming one. "This is no daemon," Lorgar said. It was not. Daemons are shaped by the Chaos God's power, defined by their divine patron's nature, oriented towards serving that patron's desire. What Corax had become was shaped by nothing but himself, by the choice to learn warfare from political prisoners, by 98 days on Istvan V, by the children who died in the atomic fire over Kievar. and by the promise he had carried to the mutated raptors and been unable to keep, by the year of silence behind a sealed door, by the word he had spoken before the eye closed around him. He was Corvus Corax, made of warp stuff and shadow, and an intention that had survived everything the universe had thrown at it for centuries. He was precisely himself, and he was coming for Lorga. Part 8. The Shadow of the Past. Hunting the Word-Bearers through the Eye. The Word-Bearers who inhabit Sycharis and the other demon worlds within the Eye of Terror have developed, over 10,000 years, a particular culture of fear. This is not unusual for Chaos worshippers. Fear is one of the foundational currencies of the Warp, and the various servants of the ruinous powers maintain their positions through complex ecologies of threat and submission that would look familiar to anyone who has studied the dynamics of highly hierarchical criminal organizations. What is unusual is the nature of one specific fear that runs through the Word-Bearers' culture with a consistency and a specificity that sets it apart from the standard anxieties of inhabiting a dimension made from suffering. They call it the hunting shadow. The name is not consistent across all warbands and all time periods. Different groups have different words for it, and some deny its existence even while taking precautions against it. But the referent is always the same. Something in the eye that hunts them. Something that cannot be bargained with, appeased, or detected until it is already inside your perimeter and your brothers are dying. Something that has a shape like a Primarch but moves like weather, that might be a cloud of ravens or a figure of blades, or simply a darkness that has acquired intent. The short story, Shadow of the Past, by Gav Thorpe, collected in the anthology Sons of the Emperor, is the primary canonical account of what this thing is and what it does. It repays close reading because it is doing something more sophisticated than simply depicting a powerful entity hunting Chaos Space Marines. It is making an argument, quietly, through the specific details of how Corax behaves and what Lorga says about him, and how both of those things differ from what you would expect if this were simply a story about corruption or revenge. The story opens on a demon world inside the Eye that belongs to the Word-Bearers, administered by a dark apostle named Kaltar. The world is exactly what a Word-Bearer's demon world looks like, built on slave labor and ritual sacrifice. Its architecture expressing the theological priorities of a legion that has made worship their highest value. Kaltar is overseeing the construction of a monument to Lorgar's glory, a vast edifice that will serve as a focus for devotional practice across multiple nearby systems, the kind of project that the Word-Bearers excel at and take genuine religious satisfaction in completing. He is experienced, politically sophisticated within the Legion's hierarchy, and not given to panic. He is, by the standards of heretic Astartes, competent. His warriors start dying. They die in the dark. It's in patrol corridors, in guard posts, in positions that should have been well defended. The survivors' accounts are consistent. The darkness moved. There was no sound. There was no warning. The darkness moved, and then someone was gone, and then sometimes there was screaming, and then the screaming stopped. Kaltar's initial assessment is territorial in nature. Demons operating without sanction in Word-Bearer-controlled space was not unusual, and the response to it was a routine part of administering a demon world. He performs the appropriate rituals, attempts to identify the entity and negotiate or drive it out, brings in additional resources. The rituals do not produce the expected results. The killings continue. What Kaltar's extended investigation determines, and this is where the situation becomes genuinely unusual, is that the entity is not responding to the specific psychic frequencies that demons use for interaction. It does not desire worship. It does not desire sacrifice. It is not seeking submission or allegiance or any of the things that warp entities in this space reliably want. What it wants is for the Word-Bearers in this specific location to stop existing. It is making that desire very clear and very efficiently, and nothing in Kaltar's considerable experience of dealing with warp entities has equipped him to negotiate with something that simply wants them dead with no other agenda. When Kaltar finally encounters the entity directly, But what he sees does not resolve cleanly into any category his training has prepared him for. A darkness that has eyes, a cloud that has intent, a shape that moves between something like a human figure and something like a storm of birds, operating with a coherence and a directedness that is fundamentally incompatible with the behavior of a mindless predator. This is someone, not something, someone who has made a specific decision to be here and is acting on that decision with the discipline of someone who has been doing this for a very long time. Lorgar appears. He manifests because something has been operating in his domain long enough and with sufficient effect to require his personal attention, and because whatever political survival instincts he has retained through his transformation into a demon Primarch have flagged this situation as one that requires him specifically. He arrives in his full ascended form, a being of considerable height and considerable power, radiating the combined attention of the Chaos Gods in ways that physical space bends slightly to accommodate. He looks at the darkness looks at him, and then it does something remarkable. It grows, it pulls shadow and form and intention together, building itself upward, taking on a specific and recognizable shape, a shape with alabaster skin, a shape with eyes that are solidly black, a shape wearing armor that was once sable and gold, and that still, in its rebuilt form, carries the aesthetic echo of what it was, the shape of Corvus Corax, a Primarch of the Raven Guard, who has been dead to the Imperium for long enough that most living Space Marines have him only as history, rather than as memory. The dialogue that follows is worth reading very carefully, because it is doing the philosophical heavy lifting that makes Corax's transformation meaningful rather than simply dramatic. Corax says, and this is quoted or closely paraphrased in multiple lore sources from the original text, that he is what he always has been, vengeance incarnate, justice delivered. He says that this place, beyond the veil of the material world, has revealed what they all are. Underneath the veneer of humanity, their father crafted for them. They are of the warp. This is not a confession. It is not self-condemnation, but it is a statement of fact delivered with the cool precision that has always characterized how Corvus Corax talks about difficult truths. He is not denying what he has become. He is placing it in context, explaining that what the eye has revealed is not corruption, but nature. Lorgar, whose entire existence is built on the premise that this is true, and that the correct response to it is submission to the powers of the warp, asks the obvious follow-up. Have you come to join us? Have you come to make oath to the powers that made you? No. And the no is delivered not as a refusal born of resistance, but as a statement of irrelevance. Corax does not need to join the Chaos Gods. He does not require their patronage to be what he is. He is not converting from one allegiance to another. He is still, which despite everything that has happened to his form, precisely who he was, which means that the Chaos Gods have nothing to offer him that he wants, and he has nothing to offer them that he would be willing to give. The question makes no more sense to him than asking a river to join the ocean by way of a desert. He is not going that direction. He was never going that direction. The Eye of Terror revealed his warped nature, without changing what that nature was oriented toward. The battle that follows ranges across the temple fortress in a way that demonstrates unambiguously that Corax, in his transformed state, is genuinely dangerous in a way that even a demon Primarch on his own demon world needs to take seriously. Yet they are two Primarchs who have both become more than they were. Lorgar through willing compact and accumulated divine investment, Corax through involuntary revelation and sustained self-maintained purpose. And the collision between them is not a foregone conclusion. Corax has the upper hand. He presses it. He pins Lorgar, carves into him with blades that are no longer separate weapons, but extensions of himself, delivers damage that should by any reasonable accounting be decisive. He is, for the second time in his existence, within moments of ending Lorgar. Lorgar escapes by summoning a gathered surge of power that buys him seconds, retreating to a sealed chamber and slamming doors between them. The warp barrier those doors create is something Corax cannot immediately pass. The raven swarm beats against it, scratching and cutting. Oshi, but the ward holds for long enough. Lorgar escapes again, the specific reversal that has defined the relationship between these two since Istvan V, where Lorgar survived because Kurzi intervened. Now Lorgar survives because he built himself an escape route in advance. On the far side of the sealed door, Corax tells Lorgar what happens next. He has Lorgar's scent now. He knows what he is hunting and where it goes to ground. He will find him again. And when he does, every word-bearer who has ever drawn breath will have reason to remember the day the shadow came to Sycharis. Then the shadow disperses, and the demon world is left with its dead and its damaged, and the memory of something that was supposed to be impossible. A loyalist Primarch operating inside the Eye of Terror. Not captured, not corrupted, not dead, but hunting. She's still hunting. After everything. Still hunting. Part 9. Still loyal, still human. The moral complexity for Pisa of the Raven's shadow. Here is the detail that the lore is most careful to preserve, and that would be easiest to overlook in the visceral spectacle of what Corax has become. He still makes moral distinctions. The word-bearers who have experienced the hunting shadow describe it as something utterly without mercy toward their warriors. This is accurate, and the accounts are consistent. Corax does not negotiate. He does not offer surrender. He does not spare the heretic Astartes who encounter him. The word-bearers die when he finds them, and they die efficiently, and the manner of their dying is not gentle. By any visual standard that a human observer would apply from the outside, by any external reading of the behavior, this is what monsters do. But the accounts of enslaved populations on the word-bearers' demon worlds tell a very different part of the story. These worlds run on slave labor, human beings taken in raids, pressed into the construction of monuments and the maintenance of the infrastructure of chaos occupation, performing the endless physical work that divine power is too important to be bothered with. These people are not warriors. They did not choose to be where they are. They are there because ships came out of the warp and took them, and no one who mattered asked them how they felt about it. And when the hunting shadow moves through those worlds, killing word-bearers in the dark, these people are not harmed. More than that. Some of them find their chains cut. Some of them find locks opened that should not have been opened. Some of them find the guards who were supposed to be watching them absent, not because the shadow killed them in the slave quarters, but because the shadow arranged its hunt to ensure that when the guards died, they died elsewhere, away from the people who could not protect themselves from the secondary consequences of a demon world engagement. The timing of the killings, the routing of the shadow through the fortress, the specific sequence in which targets were taken down. These show, in the accounts that have survived, the marks of someone who was thinking about more than just killing the next target. Someone who was thinking about who else was in the room and what would happen to them if they were not accounted for. Consider what this means. On a being that has been continuously immersed in the raw energy of the warp for what amounts to centuries, a consciousness that has surrendered its biological body and operates now as something that scholars of the Imperium would struggle to categorize cleanly. Something that, by the logic of the universe it inhabits, should have long since been corrupted into either a chaos servant or a mindless entity of destruction. And this thing still stops, still in the middle of a hunt that has no strategic requirement for mercy, to make sure that the people who are taken against their will do not get hurt in the crossfire. That is not what monsters do. That is specifically and exclusively what a person does. A person with a specific history of having been the one in chains, who learned from direct experience what that position felt like and what it obligated the people with power to do, and who has never in any subsequent year of any subsequent century forgotten that lesson or allowed it to be superseded by any more recent priority. The community analysis around Corax notes this with appropriate emphasis. While he is a ruthless and monstrous entity to the word-bearers, he goes out of his way to protect the Chaos slaves. His moral compass has remained intact. That phrase, his moral compass has remained intact, is doing the most important work in the entire description of what Corax has become, because it is insisting that what he is now and what he was in the tunnels of Lycaeus are still, at the most fundamental level, the same thing. The form has changed. The expression has changed. Trust the shape that the commitment takes in the Eye of Terror looks nothing like the shape it took on Deliverance or in the fields of the Great Crusade. But the commitment itself, the specific orientation toward a specific distinction between people who chose to participate in systems of oppression and people who were caught in those systems involuntarily, that is intact. There is also the matter of what Lorgar himself said in the confrontation on Sycharis. This is no demon. Lorgar said this, not as a compliment, not as a reassurance. He said it as a statement of fact from someone who had made himself an expert on the taxonomy of warp entities, who had spent 10,000 years in the most warp-saturated environment available, who had intimate personal familiarity with what demons were and how they operated because he had invited them into his legion and eventually into his own transformed body. When Lorgar says this is no demon, he is saying something specific. This entity does not operate according to the logic of warp entities. It does not serve any chaos god. It does not respond to the standard protocols for dealing with warp entities. It is something for which his extensive experience has not prepared him, and the something that it is still, in some essential sense, that he cannot fully articulate, but that he can clearly feel, Corvus Corax. The chaos gods have had centuries to corrupt him. The Eye of Terror has reshaped him utterly in physical terms. He has surrendered his biological existence and become something that operates by principles the material universe barely has categories for, and he is still, underneath all of it, the deliverer, still the person who hid in the dark and organized the slaves, and struck at the precise moment when the blow could free people, rather than simply hurt them, still looking for the chains to cut, still noticing who is in the room and what they deserve, from a being with the power to affect their situation. This continuity of purpose, across such radical discontinuity of form, is one of the most genuinely interesting things in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Not the most dramatic, not the most visually striking, but genuinely interesting. In the way that things are interesting when they make you sit with a question rather than simply answering it. The question Corax's story poses is, what are you, essentially, when you strip away everything circumstantial, the body, the position, the immediate context of your decisions, the specific form in which you exist at any given moment? What remains? Is there something irreducible about a person that persists through radical transformation? Or are we simply the sum of our current conditions, malleable beyond recognition by enough sustained pressure? The Chaos Gods would answer this question in one direction. The entire premise of chaos corruption is that given sufficient time and sufficient exposure, anything can be remade in the image of what the warp desires. The specific flavors vary by god. Horn's cultivation of rage, Tzeentch's warping of ambition, Nurgle's perversion of acceptance, or Slaanesch's distortion of sensation, but the mechanism is the same. Find what a person already values, amplify it, bend it, cultivate the seed of a god's nature in the soil of the person's existing values, until the cultivated thing crowds out everything else, and the person is indistinguishable from a servant. Corax refuses that argument. Not by resisting the transformation, he did not and could not resist it. The Eye of Terror was not something you negotiated with on your own terms. He refuses it by not having the right seeds. His core values do not contain what any specific chaos god requires. He is not faithful enough in the right direction for Lorgar's patrons. He is not wrathful in a way that Horn can redirect. He is not devoted to sensation or beauty in the way Slaanesh requires, and he is so completely and unsentimental about the reality of suffering, so thoroughly without illusion about what the world does to people and what the people who survive it are like, that Nurgle's nihilistic acceptance finds nothing to work with. He is immune to corruption, not through purity, but through specificity. He is too precisely himself, in ways that do not overlap usefully with what chaos needs him to become, to be remade as something that serves the ruinous power's agenda. Part 10. What does it mean? The philosophy of the transformation and the future. Let us talk about what Corvus Corax's story is actually about at its deepest level. The argument the lore is making beneath all the specific events, beneath all the battles and betrayals and laboratories and locked rooms. Because there is an argument there, and it is one of the more interesting ones in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is one of the most philosophically pessimistic settings in popular fiction. It is a universe in which the structures meant to protect humanity have become, in most of their expressions, terrifying in their own right, in which the light of civilization is maintained at the cost of atrocities that would define lesser empires as monsters, in which hope is described, across most of the setting's narrative tradition, as either naive or actively dangerous, in which the question, does goodness ultimately prevail, is met with the setting's famous summary: in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Within that framework, yes, the question of whether anything essentially good about a person can survive radical transformation is not an abstract puzzle. It is the most pressing question the setting contains, because it determines whether any of the endless sacrifice at the heart of the Imperium's existence has a point. If goodness cannot survive what the universe throws at it, if everything good gets corrupted eventually, if the darkness wins by attrition even against people who resist it consciously, then the whole edifice of the Imperium's idealism is just suffering with better rhetoric. The question of who wins the eternal war becomes merely a question of which kind of terrible gets to be in charge. Corvus Corax's story is the lore's most detailed and most carefully constructed answer to that question, and the answer it gives is yes. I says the essential thing can survive, but the answer comes with complications that prevent it from being simple comfort. It can survive, but it does not survive unchanged. Corax is not who he was before the Eye. He cannot go back to being who he was. The biological Primarch who walked into the Eye of Terror has not walked back out and will not. What came out instead is something older, stranger, and harder to categorize. The survival of his essential self did not preserve his essential form. It did not spare him from becoming something that looks, from outside, very much like what a monster looks like. The price of survival was everything except the core commitment that defined him. Everything else was stripped away. The man is gone. The shadow remains. It can survive, but the form that survival takes does not necessarily look like victory. Corax achieved something extraordinary, and it looks, from most available viewing angles, like a tragedy. He is not celebrated. He is not returned. He cannot stand beside his sons and tell them that he found what he was looking for in the Eye, and that everything is resolved now. He is still in there, still hunting, still working through the list of people who destroyed his legion and his innocence, still making the specific, moral distinctions that a weapon would not bother to make. But he is doing it as something that the Imperium, if it knew, would struggle to receive with gratitude rather than horror. This is honest. This is what survival in the Warhammer universe actually looks like for things that genuinely try to survive it. Not triumph, not restoration, and not the return to what you were before the worst happened. Just continuation, the specific thing you were, expressed in whatever form the universe has left available. Doing what you were doing before in the only way that is still possible. Corax is delivering people from chains. He does it as a shadow that tears through demon worlds and frees the slaves the word-bearers left to build their monuments. It is the same work. It is entirely unrecognizable. Now, consider what the lore is saying about identity through all of this. What it means that the warp stripped away the biological layer and revealed the warp-formed consciousness underneath. This is not just a narrative device for giving Corax a dramatic new power set. It is a statement about what Primarchs fundamentally are, and by extension, a statement about what consciousness and identity fundamentally are in this setting. If the warp-formed consciousness is the real Corax, and the biological body was a layer constructed around it, then what happened in the Eye of Terror was not a transformation, but a revelation. The eye did not make him into something different. It removed what was different and showed what was always there. And what was always there was already shaped, not by the warp's formlessness, not by whatever a chaos god would have preferred to find, but by everything Corax experienced and chose and built through the decades of his lived existence. His warped soul was not blank clay waiting to be shaped by the eye. It was already Corax, already carrying the specific orientation that Lycaeus and Istvan Futh and the Ravenspire had built into it. The eye could reveal that orientation, but it could not replace it, because there was nothing in the warp that corresponded to what Corax was oriented toward. There was no divine template to impose. There was only the thing he already was, made of warp stuff and shadow and refusal. This is a profound statement about the nature of selfhood in a universe where the warp is always present. It says that who you are is not merely your current biological state. It is something deeper and more durable, something that carries the history of your choices and your losses and your commitments in a form that physical transformation cannot reach. The warp can take your body. It cannot take the person who lived in it, and as long as that person was specific enough and honest enough and committed enough to have shaped the consciousness underneath in ways that the warp has no template to override. The chaos gods corrupt by amplifying and redirecting what is already there. They need something to work with, and if there is nothing that maps onto their domains, they have no purchase. Corax's specific orientation gave them nothing to work with. The result is a warp entity that operates by no warp entity logic the setting had previously described. Not a demon Primarch. Something new, something that might require new categories entirely. What happens next, in the lore, is the open question that Games Workshop has been maintaining carefully. What the setting's treatment of returning Primarchs has demonstrated a pattern. Gilliman returned from stasis. The lion emerged from wherever he had been preserved. There is an ongoing precedent for Primarchs coming back into the contemporary setting, and Corax's continued existence inside the eye, his continued activity, his continued moral coherence, his continued purpose, is clearly not maintained in the lore simply as historical colour. It is potential energy. The Raven Lord is still in there, still working. The lore is pointing at something, even if it has not yet said what. What a return might look like is genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty is appropriate to who Corax is. A biological restoration seems incompatible with the transformation that has already fully occurred. What is more plausible, as and more consistent with the character of a being who has always preferred to accomplish his objectives without fanfare, is something more oblique, the shadow returning when it is needed, a presence in specific places at specific moments, the darkness working in ways that support the people who need supporting, and undermine the people who need undermining, without announcement, without the kind of visible commitment that would require the Imperium to formally decide how to classify him. He was always most effective as something that you could not quite see clearly. He was always close himself when he was working in the gap between what people noticed and what was actually happening. The Eye of Terror has made him more completely that thing than he ever was when he had a body. He does not need to walk back in through the front door. What he may already be there, in the places where the shadows have started to move with unusual purpose, in the moments when something finds the locks open that should not have been opened. The fan community, which has thought about this carefully for years, maintains a persistent tradition that Corax will return for whatever the endgame of the 40K setting eventually looks like. That when the Emperor rises, if the Emperor rises, when the final accounting of 10,000 years of war approaches something like a conclusion, Corvus Corax will be there. Not because he was summoned, not because some mechanism of salvation retrieved him, but because he was never actually gone. He was in the eye, working through the list, waiting for the call that could not be ignored. And the people who have been doing the waiting, the Raven Guard, his sons, as who have kept his memory and his doctrine through all the centuries since the door closed, will look up when the shadow moves, and they will recognize something in it. Not the man they remember from the histories, because that man was made of flesh and is gone, but the thing underneath the man, the specific quality of attention, the way the darkness falls in a particular shape, the sense that somewhere in the movement a choice was made about who would be protected and who would not, and the choice was made correctly. The deliverer, still delivering, doing it in the dark, in the only way that is still possible. Addition Part 11, the broader significance, why this story matters for the setting. Corvus Corax's transformation into what the lore calls a warp-formed consciousness is not just a dramatic development in one Primarch's story. It is a piece of lore that, if taken seriously, has implications for how we understand the Primarchs as a category and for how we understand the warp's relationship to loyal Imperial forces. Every Primarch, the lore now implies, has this layer underneath. The warp-formed consciousness, the essential self that is made of immaterium substance, that would be revealed if the biological layer were stripped away. This is what Corax says in his confrontation with Lorgar. Underneath the veneer of humanity their father crafted for them, they are of the warp. He is not claiming this only for himself. He is stating it as the general truth about all of them. Lorgar heard it as an invitation. Corax meant it as a description. This raises interesting questions about the other Primarchs. The loyal ones who are currently active, Guilliman, the lion, are walking around in their biological bodies, fully operational as biological entities. But the implication of Corax's statement is that they, too, have warp-formed consciousnesses underneath. Consciousnesses that reflect everything they have experienced and chosen and built. If Guilliman's warp soul were revealed, what would it contain? The architect of the Codex Astartes, the administrator who rebuilt a shattered Imperium, the pragmatist who makes unilateral decisions and sleeps tolerably well, the man who read through 10,000 years of Imperial history and found it profoundly depressing and decided to do something about it anyway. These things would be there, underneath, in whatever form the warp expresses the specific character of a consciousness that has made those choices and lived with those consequences. This also raises questions about what the Emperor intended. He made the Primarchs this way, with warp-formed consciousnesses at their core, with biological layers constructed around them. Did he know that sustained warp exposure could strip the biological layer and reveal the core? Did he intend for this to be a possibility, a last resort, an emergency survival mechanism? Was the Eye of Terror's revelation of Corax something the Emperor might have anticipated? Might have even designed the Primarchs to be capable of surviving, precisely because he knew that some of them might need to operate in environments that biological forms could not survive indefinitely. The lore does not answer these questions. The Emperor is in the Golden Throne and not particularly available for clarification, but the questions are there, and they are interesting, and they suggest that what happened to Corvus Corax might be a feature rather than a catastrophe, a designed-in resilience expressing itself in the most extreme possible circumstances. There is one more dimension of Corax's story worth exploring before we close, and it has to do with the specific relationship between his transformation and the fear he spent his mortal life carrying, the fear of becoming Conrad Kurz. He is now, in many respects, was closer to Kurz's external profile than he has ever been. He is something that moves through darkness, that kills without hesitation, that has essentially abandoned the physical world and the people in it in favor of an existence defined entirely by violence and vengeance. The tactical similarities between his current mode of operation and the Night Lord's terror campaigns are, on the surface, substantial. If Kurz could see what Corax has become, he might reasonably argue that he had been right all along, that Corax was always headed here, and that the distinctions Corax drew between them were simply a longer road to the same destination. But Kurz would be wrong, and the wrongness is in the detail that the lore preserves most carefully, the chains that get cut. Ask the guards who die away from the slave quarters, so the slaves are not in the crossfire. The distinction, maintained meticulously through centuries of warp existence and radical transformation, between the people who chose to participate in the Wordbearer's empire and the people who were taken and pressed into it. Kurz never maintained that distinction. Kurz did not have that distinction in his value system in any robust or consistent way. The people he governed by fear included everyone, the innocent, the guilty, the willing, the coerced, all of them subject to the same ambient terror, all of them useful to him as bearers of the emotion he needed to sustain his power. Corax, even as a shadow, even as something that the warp has stripped down to its irreducible core, maintains that distinction. But it is the last surviving expression of everything the political prisoners and the criminals and the exhausted workers of Lycaeus taught him. It is the thing they named him for, and it is still there, operating correctly, in the worst environment in the galaxy, carried by a form that no longer resembles anything they would have recognized. He did not become Kersey. He became something that looks, from the outside, superficially like what a very dark and very powerful Kersey might resemble. But that underneath that surface is still oriented, precisely and specifically, towards something Kersey never was. The liberation of the people who did not choose to be there. This is the answer to the question posed at the very beginning of this video. Why did Corvus Corax become a monster? Not because the darkness corrupted him, or not because grief broke him, not because the warp unmade him in the way it unmakes most things. He became a monster because the universe stripped away everything except what he was at his most fundamental level, and what he was at his most fundamental level was a weapon forged by enslaved people to free enslaved people. And weapons, when you strip away everything else, look like exactly what they are. He is still that weapon. He is just made of different materials now. Closing thoughts. The Raven Lord, the Shadow, and the promise of return. The story of Corvus Corax is not finished. It is deliberately, pointedly unfinished. The law has maintained his continued existence, his continued activity, or his continued moral coherence with too much care and too much detail for this to be simply a way of explaining why a Primarch is not available for the contemporary setting. It is pointing at something future, something the setting has not yet shown us, but that it is clearly preparing for. The Raven Guard of the 41st Millennium do not know what happened to their father. They maintain his memory as an absence, as a single word spoken before a door closed and did not reopen. They honor him. They carry forward the doctrine he established, the preference for the unseen, strike over the direct assault, the care for minimizing collateral harm, the specific quality of attention to who is vulnerable and what that vulnerability obligates the people with power to do. They fight in his name without knowing whether he is still fighting at all. The hunting shadow continues to operate. The word-bearers' demon worlds receive unexpected visitors. Slaves find their chains cut in the dark, and somewhere in the shifting reality-optional landscape of the Imperium, something with two black eyes and a shape that resolves into a Primarch when it chooses to, is still working through the list, patiently and with total commitment. The way you work through a list when you have accepted that you have all the time available and the work is the only thing left. Every far moon night on Deliverance, when the moon reaches its yearly high point over Kyavar, something howls from the old Apothecarion, where the mutated raptors were kept. The first company guards at the doors through the night, every night, year after year. Whether what howls is memory or something more literal, that the law does not specify, but it keeps the vigil, because the Raven Guard have always understood that the things you carry do not stop being real just because they have taken a form you no longer recognize. When he returns, and the structure of the law strongly implies that he will, it will not be through a ceremonial gate with a formal announcement. It will be something quieter and stranger and more consistent with who he has always been. A presence in specific places at specific moments. The darkness, moving with purpose. The chains coming open in rooms where they were supposed to stay locked. The deliverer, in the only form that delivering still permits. For those who have kept the faith. For those who have held the line in the dark while the shadow hunted. For the sons and daughters of the Raven Guard, who carry his name and his methods and his specific quality of care about who gets hurt in the crossfire, he is not gone. He is in the eye, and the eye has not broken him. And one day the list will be complete, or the call will come that cannot be ignored, and the shadow will move in a direction that matters more than the one it has been moving in. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, a purpose that holds through every possible transformation is something rarer and more precious than any weapon. Corax has that. He has had it since the day Nasturia Phrenia found a pale child in a cavern and decided to hide him and feed him and give him a name that meant hope. He is still the deliverer. He is just delivering from inside the dark now. He was always most comfortable there. And that, for now, utters the story of why Corvus Corax became a monster made by a universe that stripped everything away until only the essential thing remained. A monster that still, in the deepest dark, knows the difference between the person holding the chain and the person wearing it. A monster that the word monster barely fits, because the thing underneath has never stopped being, in the most fundamental sense, the person those enslaved workers named for what they needed most, the deliverer. If this journey through the full arc of Corvus Corax has moved you in any direction, if you found yourself thinking about something differently, or wanting to pick up Deliverance Lost, or tracking down the Shadow of the Past short story in the Sons of the Emperor anthology, or simply wanting to spend more time with the lore of the Raven Guard, then this video has done exactly what it was supposed to do. Hit that like button if the Raven Lord's story got to you in some way. Subscribe if you want to keep joining me for slow, detailed, atmospheric walks through the corners of 40K lore that deserve more careful attention than they sometimes receive. And leave a comment telling me which part of Corax's story lands hardest for you personally. Is it Istvan V, the Raptor program? The word at the door of the Raven Spire? Or is it the idea that whatever he has become in the Eye of Terror still stops to cut the chains of the people who never chose to be there? I read every single comment, and conversations about lore this rich and this carefully constructed are genuinely what this channel exists for. Or for Q on 40K, this has been the story of the Raven Lord. The Shadows thank you for sitting with them a while. Nevermore.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.